The radio crackled to life at 2:47 a.m. as Marvin Gaye sat alone in his Cadillac, parked outside a 24-hour diner in downtown Detroit. He'd been driving aimlessly for hours, running from another sleepless night, another argument with his father, another spiral into the darkness that had been consuming him since returning from Belgium. The cocaine was wearing off, leaving behind that familiar hollow ache in his chest, and he reached for the dial to fill the silence that threatened to swallow him whole. The DJ's voice cut through the static. "Here's a classic from the Prince of Soul." Then came the opening notes, those distinctive piano chords, that smooth, yearning voice that had made millions of people fall in love, feel understood, find solace in their own loneliness. But as Marvin listened, his hand froze on the steering wheel. His eyes narrowed. His breathing became shallow. "Who is this?" he whispered to the empty car. The voice on the radio was foreign to him. Alien. It carried notes and emotions he didn't remember creating, expressed feelings he couldn't connect to his own experience. This wasn't his voice. This couldn't be his voice. The man singing about love and healing sounded confident, whole, hopeful. The man sitting in the Cadillac was broken, paranoid, barely clinging to sanity. Marvin frantically turned the volume up, then down, then up again. He pressed his ear close to the speaker, searching for something familiar, some trace of himself in those notes. But all he heard was a stranger singing his songs. That was the moment Marvin Gaye began to disappear from himself completely. The radio went silent, but Marvin's mind continued racing. He stumbled out of the Cadillac and walked toward the diner's neon-lit entrance, his reflection catching in the glass door. For a moment he stopped and stared at the man looking back at him. The face was familiar, yet strange. Inside the diner, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The waitress glanced up from her crossword puzzle. "You okay, honey?" she asked, noticing his disheveled appearance. Marvin nodded but didn't speak. He was afraid of his voice, afraid it would sound as foreign as it had on the radio. He pointed to the coffee pot, and the waitress poured him a cup. As he sat there, Marvin became acutely aware of every sound his body made, the rhythm of his breathing, the clearing of his throat. Were these sounds his? The cocaine paranoia was mixing with something deeper now, a fundamental questioning of his own existence. He caught his reflection again in the window beside his booth. The man in the glass looked hollow, aged beyond his years, nothing like the smooth performer on album covers. Marvin raised his hand. The reflection did the same. He touched his face. So did the reflection. But the synchronization felt mechanical, like a puppet being controlled rather than natural movement. "That's your song on the radio earlier?" the waitress asked, apparently recognizing him despite his deteriorated appearance. "Sexual healing? My daughter loves that one." Marvin's throat constricted. He wanted to say no, that it belonged to someone else, someone who used to exist but didn't anymore. Instead, he managed a weak smile and nodded. "You got such a beautiful voice," she continued, wiping down the counter. "Always did. My mother used to play your records when I was little. Said you could make anybody believe in love again." Each word felt like a weight pressing down on his chest. Beautiful voice. Your records. You could make anybody believe. All references to a person he could no longer access, talents he could no longer claim as his own. The waitress leaned closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "You sure you're all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." She paused, studying his face. "My husband, he fought in Korea. Came back looking just like you do now. Took him years to find himself again." Marvin almost laughed at the accuracy of her observation. He had seen a ghost, his own. "I'm fine," he whispered. But even those two words sounded foreign to his ears, like someone else was speaking through him. The waitress's comparison to her veteran husband struck deep. He was a casualty of his own success, wounded by fame instead of war. "Sometimes," she said gently, refilling his cup, "we lose pieces of ourselves along the way. But they're still there, just buried deep. You just got to dig them back up." After the waitress walked away, Marvin pulled out a small pocket mirror he'd been carrying since Belgium, a habit developed during his paranoid episodes, constantly checking to see if he looked like himself. Under the harsh diner lighting, his reflection seemed to shift and blur. The eyes looking back at him were his father's eyes, cold and judgmental. The mouth was his grandfather's, stern and disapproving. Where was Marvin in this face? He whispered his name, Marvin, testing how it sounded, how it felt on his tongue. Even that seemed wrong, like he was calling someone else's name, expecting someone else to answer. To understand the depth of Marvin's breakdown, you need to understand what his voice meant to the world. It wasn't just an instrument. It was a bridge between the sacred and the sensual, the political and the personal. When Marvin sang, he channeled something that felt both deeply intimate and universally human. His voice could make you believe in love when you'd given up on it, could make you question society when you'd accepted its flaws, could make you feel less alone in a world that often felt indifferent to suffering. Berry Gordy had recognized this power early on. At Motown, Marvin's voice became the gold standard, the template against which other artists were measured. It sold millions of records, filled concert halls, defined a generation's soundtrack. But somewhere along the way, that voice had become a prison. By 1983, Marvin felt like a ventriloquist whose dummy had become more famous than he was. The public knew Marvin Gaye, the performer, the smooth crooner, the social consciousness of soul music. But Marvin Gaye Jr., the preacher's son from D.C. who'd grown up in fear and shame, who struggled with addiction and depression, who couldn't reconcile his spiritual upbringing with his sexual desires, that man was invisible, even to himself. The radio incident wasn't the first time Marvin had felt disconnected from his own artistry. It had been building for years, this sense of estrangement from the voice that had defined his identity. After the success of What's Going On, after the triumph of Let's Get It On, after the raw honesty of Here, My Dear, Marvin felt increasingly like an actor playing a role written by someone else. In interviews, he would speak about Marvin Gaye in the third person, as if discussing a character he'd created but no longer controlled. Marvin Gaye wants this, he'd say. Marvin Gaye feels that. Friends noticed this verbal tic, but dismissed it as artistic pretension. They didn't realize it was a symptom of something much deeper. The cocaine made it worse. Under the influence, Marvin felt simultaneously more and less himself. More creative, more confident, more connected to the music flowing through him, but also more detached from reality, more suspicious of everyone around him, more convinced that the person in the mirror wasn't who he used to be. During recording sessions for Sexual Healing, engineers noted that Marvin would often stop mid-take and ask to hear his vocals played back. He would listen with a confused expression, as if trying to solve a puzzle. That doesn't sound right, he'd say, though technically the performance was flawless. Play it again, and again, and again. What Marvin was really searching for was himself. As the song on the radio continued, Marvin's breathing became more labored. His hands began to shake, the voice singing about sexual healing, about love as redemption, about finding peace through connection. It sounded like a mockery of his current reality. Here was a man singing about healing while sitting in a car at 3 a.m., high on cocaine, estranged from his family, running from his problems like a scared child. He reached for the radio dial, desperate to turn it off, but couldn't bring himself to do it. Some part of him was fascinated by this stranger singing his songs. When had his voice started sounding so foreign? When had he lost touch with the person who could create something so beautiful? The song ended, and the DJ's voice returned. That was Marvin Gaye with Sexual Healing, riding high on the charts. Marvin laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. It was the laugh of a man who just heard his own eulogy. He turned off the radio and sat in silence for a long time. Outside, Detroit slumbered around him, the city where his dreams had been born and his nightmares had taken root. Inside the car, Marvin felt more alone than he'd ever felt in his life. Not just lonely, alone in a way that went deeper than human connection. He felt alone from himself. Over the following days, Marvin became obsessed with listening to his own music. He would drive around Detroit for hours, scanning radio stations, waiting for his songs to come on. Each time the same thing happened. The voice sounded like a stranger's. Sometimes he would call radio stations and request his own songs, just to experience that moment of disconnection again. as if repetition might restore the familiarity he'd lost. One afternoon, driven by desperation, he returned to Hitsville, USA, the original Motown studios, where so many of his classic recordings had been made. The security guard recognized him and let him in, assuming he was there for a scheduled session. Marvin didn't correct the assumption. He made his way to Studio A, the legendary room where What's Going On had been born, where I Heard It Through the Grapevine had captured lightning in a bottle. The space felt like a museum of his own past. The same microphones, the same mixing board, the same acoustic tiles that had witnessed his transformation from Marvin Gaye Jr. to Marvin Gaye. He sat at the piano, the same one where he'd worked out countless melodies and pressed a few keys. The notes rang out in the empty studio, but they felt disconnected from his fingers, as if the piano was playing itself. He tried to sing along, just a few bars of What's Going On, but his voice cracked. Not from emotion, but from unfamiliarity, like he was attempting to sing in a language he'd forgotten. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, in the room where he'd found his voice, now unable to recognize it. The walls seemed to echo with the ghost of his younger self, that confident artist who'd walked in here knowing exactly who he was and what he wanted to say. At home, he pulled out old albums, stacking them on his turntable, and listening with the intensity of a detective studying evidence. I want you. Gotta give it up. What's going on? Each recording felt like finding photographs of someone who looked like him, but wasn't him. His mother, Alberta, found him one afternoon sitting on the floor of his childhood bedroom, surrounded by vinyl records, tears streaming down his face. What's wrong, baby? She asked, kneeling beside him. I can't find myself, Mama, he whispered. I've lost my voice. Alberta looked confused. But baby, you're still singing. The radio plays your songs every day. Marvin shook his head. That's not me singing. I don't know who it is, but it's not me. He picked up the What's Going On album cover, staring at the photograph of himself from over a decade ago. The man in the picture looked confident, purposeful, like he understood something about the world that brought him peace. This person, he said, pointing to the image, I used to be him, but I can't remember how it felt to be him. I can't remember how to think his thoughts or feel his feelings. Alberta sat beside him on the floor, her presence a comfort even though she couldn't understand what he was going through. Maybe, she said softly, you're becoming someone new. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. But Marvin couldn't accept that possibility. Becoming someone new meant letting go of the person he'd been, and despite the disconnection, despite the pain, he wasn't ready to say goodbye to that version of himself. He was trapped between a past he couldn't access and a future he couldn't envision. What Marvin was experiencing was depersonalization, feeling detached from his own thoughts, feelings, and actions. For someone whose entire identity was built around their voice, this disconnection was devastating. Years of performing a public persona had created a chasm between his public and private selves that had finally become impossible to bridge. In quiet moments, Marvin would press his hands against his throat, feeling for vibrations, trying to reconnect with the physical source of his voice. He would hum scales, testing whether the sounds emerging from his body belonged to him. Most of the time, they didn't. The radio revelation had a devastating effect on Marvin's ability to perform. If he couldn't recognize his own recorded voice, how could he trust his live voice? What if he opened his mouth to sing and nothing came out? Or worse, what if someone else's voice emerged? Scheduled recording sessions became torture. Marvin would stand at the microphone, headphones on, band ready, but couldn't bring himself to sing. The disconnect between the voice in his head and the voice he heard through the speakers was too jarring. He would make excuses. His throat was sore. The mix wasn't right. He needed to rework the arrangement. Engineers and producers grew frustrated, but they didn't understand what was happening. They saw a talented artist being difficult, not a man who'd lost his sense of self so completely that he couldn't access the thing that had defined him his entire life. During one particularly difficult session, Marvin broke down completely. I'm not him, he sobbed to the producer. I'm not the person who made those records. I don't know how to be him anymore. As weeks passed, Marvin began to think of his voice as belonging to someone else, a version of himself that had died somewhere along the way. He would listen to What's Going On and feel like he was hearing the work of a dead man. The worst part was that everyone around him still expected him to be that person. Fans would quote his lyrics as if he'd personally spoken to them. His family would reference his music, assuming he's still connected with the messages he'd once delivered. Marvin felt like he was living in a museum of his own life, surrounded by artifacts from a person who'd once existed, but was now gone. The cruelest irony was that Marvin's music continued to be successful. Sexual Healing was climbing the charts, earning Grammy nominations. Critics called it a return to form, but Marvin knew better. The real Marvin Gaye was gone. What remained was an imposter, a man wearing the skin of a legend, but feeling hollow inside. He began to wonder if Marvin Gaye had always been a construction, a persona that had eventually consumed the person who'd created it. In the months that followed the radio incident, Marvin's relationship with his own voice became increasingly strained. He would wake up and hum, testing whether today might be the day the connection returned. It never did. He stopped listening to the radio altogether. When his songs came on in public places, he would leave or ask someone to change the station. The voice that had once been his salvation had become his torment. Friends and family noticed that Marvin spoke more quietly now, as if afraid to fully commit to the sounds emerging from his body. The man who had once commanded stages with the power of his voice had become afraid of his own sound. That night in the Cadillac, listening to a stranger sing his songs, Marvin Gaye had discovered something more terrifying than losing his voice. He discovered what it felt like to lose himself entirely, to become a ghost haunting his own life, forever searching for a connection to the person he used to be. The voice on the radio continued to play, continued to move people, continued to heal and inspire. But the man who'd created it was already gone, disappeared into a silence so profound that even his own sound couldn't reach him anymore.